Flying the next generation of business jets isn't as simple as buying one. It's about landing new challenges, 3 pilots on ultra-long range flights, unpaved runways, cutting-edge avionics, and even eVTOL integration. Let's dive in. In today's episode of Biz Jet TV, we're going to be looking at, these new airplanes. We've been talking about some of them. We just did a video recently about the comparison between the Gulfstream G800 and the Bombardier Global 8000, and how these airplanes have an 8,000 nautical mile range. Now, if you're going to buy one of these airplanes, the first thing you need to understand is because it's a new airplane, you're not going to find what's defined as type-rated pilots. A type-rated pilot is a pilot that's qualified to fly that particular airplane. Now, when you buy these aircraft new, the manufacturer usually give you around 4 type ratings, including the price of the airplane, plus their recurrent training. But if you're going to buy a pre-owned one, which is not necessarily, you won't get a pre-owned Global 8000 right now, but let's say you buy a Global 7500, which is almost the same airplane. It still has a long range, which will require you to have more than 2 pilots. And because there aren't that many out there, you're going to struggle to find a type rated pilot. So you're going to have to pay for the type rating. Now that type rating is quite an investment. It's $135,000 per pilot. And you're going to need a minimum of 3 pilots, because it's all lovely and nice to say we're going to fly for 13, 14 hours non-stop. But what you don't realize is that pilots have what's called as duty time. And the duty time varies depending on the jurisdiction the airplane's operated under, depending on what time you take off, and depending on how many sectors you fly. So obviously, more sectors you fly, less is the duty time. If you're taking off at 10 at night, local time, and you're flying through the night, the duty time is reduced because the pilot's not acclimatized yet. So very often, if you're going to fly those 7,500 or 8,000 nautical mile legs, you're going to need 3 pilots on board, and you're going to need a crew rest area. So you've got a budget for that. So you're not training 2 pilots now, you're training 3 pilots, and you've got 3 pilot salaries, and usually those pilot salaries anywhere between 3 to 500,000 a year to fly that kind of airplane. So you've got to, budget for this thing. It's not just about buying the nice fancy new airplane. You also have to think about, the crew. And as I always say, the pilots are more important than the airplane. So that is really, really something that we really need to focus on, in finding the right people and then getting them qualified on the airplane. Now, once they're qualified on the airplane, you're going to probably need to bring in an experienced Global 7500 pilot to fly with your pilots for at least a month to 6 weeks, to allow them to implement what they learnt in the simulator onto the airplane and make this transition flawless. In airline terms, we call it line training. So this training captain will sit there and help your pilots to put everything into practice in the real airplane, and that is really important to do that. And those people cost money too, so you have to consider that as well when you're flying around. The other thing with these airplanes, even the smaller ones, the avionics that are coming out now are really, really sophisticated. So the pilots really have to be able to get their heads around the avionics. But these avionics, because they're very sophisticated, they allow you to do a lot of other things. Where, for example, low visibility approaches. I mean, some of these airplanes now have head-up display, where the pilot is constantly looking out the window, even if the visibility is down to 0, and the runway will be projected on the screen. And so you can land with, back in the day when I did my category 2 training, one of us would look inside and the other would look outside. And then the guy that's doing the flying would then have to transition, from looking at the instruments to looking outside. And when you do this in real life and with really low visibility, and I've done it a number of times, it's interesting. It's interesting. So now airplanes have the ability to go in to airfields with low visibility. However, you do need your pilots to go through some extra training to practice that at the airports that you're going to be going into. Don't just trust, the type rating course. If you're going into Aspen a lot, make sure that your pilots have that type of training, because don't think, oh, I've got fancy avionics now, we can go into Aspen. They're still going to need some additional training to be able to implement that, because one thing is reading about it in a book. Another thing is doing it in the simulator or watching somebody do it on the computer. So it's important to factor these things in. Other thing that's coming to the market soon will be these electrical vertical takeoff and landing machines. So this will allow you to land your Global 7500 somewhere and then jump into one of these eVTOLs and then land directly in the location you're going to. I'm thinking of places like in Africa where they've always had an infrastructure problem in getting their stuff from the mines to the airport or to the port. Well, these electrical vertical takeoff and landing vehicles are going to allow the transportation of people and goods from the mine at a much lower cost and a lot quicker, and then get to the airplane and off you go. So if you're wanting to carry, I don't know, 300 kilos of gold on your Global 7500 from your mine in Congo, you can land there, get into the eVTOL, go to the mine, get your 300 kilos and fly it back to the airplane. And this is the kind of thing that's going to be happening. So this is just going to open up a lot more markets. You know, I talked about this in my book, The Quantum Economy. Those of you that haven't read the book, The Quantum Economy, here it is. I talk about the eVTOLs. I talk about how this is going to really be a great thing for the emerging markets. And so it's certainly something that you want to look into. But the technology in these new airplanes is going to require, you know, more money to manage, because you're going to need crew for all these things as well, and the training needs to be done properly so that, you know, with this new technology, that your crew know how to operate this technology in the best possible way to keep you safe. And this is important. There's been a lot of talk recently about, you know, pilots losing this skill to hand fly an airplane. I remember when I first started flying for the airlines, one of my training captains said, you know, we don't do that much manual flying in these airplanes. You know, the autopilot goes on at 400 feet and gets disengaged at sometimes 200 feet. So you're not doing that much hand flying, but, you know, in the simulator, you get a chance to do the hand flying. The reason why you don't do that much hand flying is you want to keep the passengers comfortable. And these machines, you know, they're built to be flown, you know, with all the technology that's there. But, you know, the pilots need to get their head around the technology. One of the things, for example, is when you're flying these sophisticated airplanes, avionic wise, you can do what's called vertical navigation approaches. And these VNAV approaches allow the computer to be programmed in a certain way that you would start your descent at, you know, 45,000 feet, where the thrust levers will go to idle. And if you plan it right and air traffic control cooperate, those thrust levers will stay idle until you put the landing gear down. This means less noise. This means a lower carbon footprint. This means you're burning less fuel. However, the pilots need to know how to use this type of thing, also when they're climbing and when they're descending. I've seen a lot of private jet pilots, you know, go in vertical speed mode. But, you know, these sophisticated airplanes with all these fancy avionics, they're not vertical speed up and down type airplanes. They have all these computers and avionics, and the level of sophistication is built into the system there in order to allow you to do these continuous descent approaches, to enable you to have less of a carbon footprint and save money on fuel. So, you know, your pilots really need to get their head round these things, and it's not just a simulator. This is why once they get online, they need to have an instructor that can, you know, make sure that they implement these things in the correct way, because, you know, you don't want to be throwing 300-400 kilos of fuel out the window every flight. But if your pilots are trained properly to use these avionics, which are there to make life easier, not only from a fuel perspective, but also from situational awareness, you know, these displays, you can see the obstacles left and right. Back in the day when I learned to fly, it's like a sheet of music. You look at the approach plate, and you look at the instruments, and then you need to translate and make sure where you are instrument-wise compared to the chart. And now you've got the little airplanes moving on a map, and it's all done for you in 3D. So it's a lot easier. But however, the pilots need to know how to use this in an effective way. And sometimes simulators training is not enough. I mean, you can get apps on the phone. Make sure that your pilots have everything they need to be able to continuously, you know, perform. And if they've got a special app that costs some money, that's got all the avionics on it, on their iPad, and they can practice stuff, or when they go into the simulator, you know, pay some extra money to have them do an extra simulator session, so that they can get their head around these airplanes. Because obviously with these type of airplanes, you're going to want to be going into airfields that maybe are a bit shorter. And the Global 7500 got this really incredible wing, which allows it to land in less than 4,000 feet. So you'll be going into airfields that you wouldn't have gone into with your G550, for example. But still, these airfields, you know, even if you've got an airplane with the performance, the pilots need to know what they're doing. And so the training is really, really important. So this technology is great that it's here, but, you know, remember the human factor. The human factor is really, really important. And as I say, and I've said all the way along, the pilots are more important than the plane. And so you need to hire the right people, train them and keep them trained, and on the ball in order to be able to use the airplane that you bought and all the technology on that airplane in the most effective manner to fly you around safely, save some fuel in the meantime, reduce your carbon footprint, and get you to A to B, doing more deals, or if you're traveling with your family for a holiday, that they have a nice experience. Because the other thing is, these new modern aircraft, the air systems in the aircraft, the circulation and the purification of the air is a lot better. The cabin altitude is a lot lower, so you're a lot more rested. So these are all good things that are happening with these this new technology, and technology is only going to get better. So that's all from me on this episode of Biz Jet TV. I hope you enjoyed this. Check out this other video we did where we compare the Global 8000 to the Gulfstream G800. And remember to subscribe to Biz Jet TV and also become a member of Biz Jet TV Hangar Club. It's just $10 a month. You can click on the link below for that one. And that's all from me here, Fabrizio Poli on Biz Jet TV, and I'll see you on the next one.